Day 3 of Manifesto launch week, Ben. We're going to go through the Greens in a minute, and I'm going to try and link most of what we're talking about with the polls, seeing as we have you. But first, really, the big story cutting through today is the seeming admission by the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, that Labour are going to win, thereby conceding defeat. And he's warning of a Labour supermajority, trying to mobilise, I guess, the core Tory vote. Understandably, that's made a few in his party a bit cheesed off. But as things stand on Wednesday, the 12th of June, is that the way things are heading? A Labour supermajority?
Yes, the numbers do point to what can only be described as, yes, a supermajority, or rather a super defeat for the Conservatives. Let's just remember the numbers from 2019. Tories came away with 360, 370 MPs in the House of Commons. Now they are currently forecast, according to Britain Predicts, other models are, of course, available, to get 80 seats or thereabouts. It really is silly numbers. When I put these numbers out, and I did it the last time I was on here recording, I was looking at them and I thought, this is ridiculous. You know, these numbers, look, it's based off polls as they stand now, and the polls as they stand now point to a damning defeat for the Conservatives. But I think, rewind yourself back to May. And by the way, I think we are just over halfway to polling day since Rishi Sunak called that election. And just think back to when Sunak did step out of Downing Street and did make the announcement, soaking through to the sounds of things can only get better. I was thinking, well, it's going to narrow. Of course, it's going to narrow. In nine in every 10 elections, the polls do narrow in favour of the incumbent. It looks as though, a few weeks on and a few weeks to go, the polls haven't narrowed. In some instances, they've got wider. In some, they've just stayed stock still. And what we're also noticing is, we like to talk about the many undecideds that always exist in elections, but compared to other elections, there are fewer undecideds than there normally are. People have made up their minds about the government. Who they go for now, whether it's Labour or the Lib Dems or Reform or not voting altogether, or indeed the Greens, is a bit more further up for debate. But yes, the current numbers as things stand, supermajority.
So things have not got better. It's interesting what you say about undecided voters, drawing that distinction between that they have decided not to vote Conservative, but they're undecided as to whom they will vote for or vote not at all. I mean, how can you pick that out from the numbers?
Well, it depends what you ask voters, and you can just read between the lines. So you ask voters, first of all, how do you feel about Rishi Sunak winning the next election? And you find, it is around about a quarter to a third of the Boris Johnson backing base, those that, the election coalition that could give the Conservatives, a fifth term win. A quarter to a third of them do not want Rishi Sunak's Conservatives to win re-election. And then you ask them, do you think this election should be a change of government election? YouGov finds around about a third to 4 in 10 of them think the next election should be a change of government. And Ipsos find a higher figure. I can't remember the figure, but it's around about 70% amongst the whole British public, right? And so when you look at that, when you see virtually 4 in 10 of those that backed Boris Johnson in 2019 have now having written off the Conservatives. But when you ask them how are they going to vote now, you do see a lot of uncertainty still. Is it going to be for reform? It did actually go up for reform. The numbers going for reform have gone up. But they are still uncertain about whether they're going to take the jump to the other side, to Labour. And then you also, in some rural areas, and indeed also in Bristol, you have some Conservative voters considering the Greens, because who is the lesser of the two evils when put between the Greens and Labour? And in parts of Bristol, some Conservative voters do choose the Greens. So, yes, the uncertainty that exists now amongst the Tory base have written off the Tories. Most Tory voters who are undecided have written off the Tories as like an option worth considering. Now they don't really know what to do. And to reiterate, when Sunak came, on outside Downing Street to announce the election, you would think they would have rallied back. They haven't. Why? Well, because the polls haven't changed for the past year and a bit. all of us, most of us, the vast majority of us think the time for change is now, the time for a change of government is now, and there have been very little incentive to think otherwise.
A small, amusing blip, you could see it as like, it's not just Tory voters who don't want to vote for the party. There are hints that even their own MPs are not that enamoured with them either. I mean, extraordinarily, the Conservative candidate, Andrea Jenkins, her campaign leaflets picture herself with Nigel Farage, not just once, but twice. Quite extraordinary, but I won't ask you to dwell on that. Let's go on to the Greens then, as we've mentioned them, obviously trying to win very hard that seat in Bristol and retain Brighton Pavilion. They've launched their manifesto today. Quite honestly, I mean, they've said, we don't expect to form the next government. I mean, no one would. But co-leader Adrian Ramsey said, we're speaking up for you on the issues that you care about. And his co-leader, Carla Denyer, said, now's the time to be ambitious, not unrealistic, but ambitious. And these certainly are some ambitious objectives.
Yeah. It is like a wish list, Christmas wish list about what do you really want, what can we be ambitious towards, what can we aspire towards, as opposed to what can we feasibly do. The whole Green stance this election has been pretty much furthering the very line Grant Shapps has been furthering, which is that this election is a done deal. So why don't you vote for a party that will hold the Labour Party's feet to the fire? It's a line that I'm not sure whether it will have breakthrough, because, to reiterate, as we've said before, the proportion of people who pay attention to politics, to the news, is always low. And the proportion of people who think, this election is a done deal for Labour is only around about 50-something%. It's not, not all of us think Labour's going to sweep this. There are great portions of us who are still undecided, still unsure about who's going to win, really. And so this Green messaging is very much an appeal to the logged on type of voters, those who do pay attention, those who, yes, probably are living in Brighton and Bristol and elsewhere, and more affluent areas. And the policies, the manifesto they've announced is, yes, very much like a wish list. If you were to poll every issue, most issues, the stuff about housing, the stuff about public ownership, in isolation, it's popular. It's similar to the manifesto of Labour in 2017 and 19. But what I would always say when you look at manifestos like that, in isolation, they're all popular policies, in isolation, I emphasize. But when you ask of the brand, when you ask voters, do you think this brand, this band of people, this team, do you think they can implement those policies? And do you think they are competent to do so? There is often a bit more doubt. There's often a bit more uncertainty. And that's why when you have policies like these, they only pick up steam. They only really propel you to victory when you're seen as competent. And that's why the Corbyn manifestos of 17 and 19 didn't really, they were objectively popular, but they didn't carry any perception of competence with them. And that's why, if it was adopted by Labour, if these policies were adopted by Labour, it would be a hard sell if the leadership were not seen as competent. The good thing for the Labour leadership, though, is they are seen as mostly competent. Mostly, I emphasise.
Because you're not seeing the caution in the Greens manifesto in terms of the economy that we've seen with the Conservatives, and obviously we'll get the Labour manifesto tomorrow. But, the Greens are talking about an extra 50 billion a year in health and social care, obviously way more than any of the other parties. They're talking 4 billion over the next 5 years to insulate buildings, 9 billion over the next 5 years on low carbon heating, scrapping tuition fees. I mean, in the world of work, wouldn't this be lovely? A 4-day week, and there are also big increases to the minimum wage, £15 per hour, and an uplift to benefits as well. I mean, they've said it's all costed, and I guess the core would be this 8% rise in national insurance for those earning just over £50,000, and these big wealth taxes on the super wealthy. But does it stack up, or really does it not matter? Because, as you say, they're not going to be the ones handed power on July the 5th.
Manifestos don't often matter. And it's always easy to say we're fully costed, because after the 2008 financial crisis, every party was desperately rushing to prove it was fully costed. I recall the UKIP manifesto of 2015. They really went out of there to say everything was fully costed, but once you looked between the detail, they had written off 50, 20, 30 billion pounds worth of bureaucracy cuts. Can you specify what those bureaucracy cuts are? No, you can't. You probably can't. How many health and safety officers are you cutting there? It's, fully costed. It's based, the economy is fluid. It always changes. The forecasts change. It assumes many things, and I don't think you can make those assumptions. So fully costed doesn't mean much. Does it matter? Does it matter that the Greens have put out a very boisterous manifesto in which they're promising a lot, assuming they're elected, but they have a nice little wish list here. No, I don't really think manifesto launches matter hugely. It all depends if it changes, affects, feeds the already present mood music of the nation. And that really is, for example, Theresa May's manifesto launch. Fresh conversations, a necessary conversation about the need for social care. Once you dug into the detail, you realize, what is this going to mean for people? And it got people worrying, okay? Because it was such a bolt out of the blue in an election campaign that was meant to be about Brexit, but wasn't, which is why Corbyn's Labour did so well. And so changed the narrative completely.
So manifestos can make impact for the worse, but not very often for the better.
Yeah, I really do think that. Which, if you are already seen as competent, which is what Theresa May's Conservatives were, just about. Corbyn's Labour were catching up on them just by a bit. That was a bolt out of the blue to sort of dispel preconceived notions. The launch of the Green Manifesto is not going to get much, if any, traction. What the Greens should be focusing on is the number of seats that they can win in Bristol, in Brighton, and maybe even in rural Suffolk as well.
Okay, Ben, you've mentioned Bristol, Brighton, rural Suffolk. Can take us through how the Greens are actually polling at the moment? They're going up, they're down, they're sticking, and how does that translate into seats? What's realistic?
So, what's realistic for them? It is a tough ask. It can be a tough ask because in 2010, when they struck through and got Caroline Lucas elected in Brighton Pavilion, the national polling did not point to it whatsoever. Okay, they're a bit more established than that now. They're currently polling, according to Britain Elects, around about 6%. They've been hovering around that for a while, and I don't know, it's not comical, it's a bit quite dramatic, but every time there's a heat wave, their numbers do rise a little bit, just by half a percentage point or two.
But so they're going to do terribly then, because I think we've woken up in autumn, we've skipped summer completely.
Yes, I was out yesterday, and I was just like, this is freezing. I'm wearing a t-shirt. This is
ridiculous.
It's terrible, but to be honest, I love colder weather, so I'm buzzing about this election campaign, actually, despite the loads of stress it's given me. They're polling 6%, roundabout. That's good enough for them. That would net them about 2 to 3 million votes, if the election was held now. But, of course, it's going to be concentrated in places they need to be targeting. And they currently have one seat, Brighton Pavilion, which the jury is presently out on whether they can actually hold. The Greens ran the council for a fair while, not as a majority, but in coalition. And after they ran it, they were roundly kicked out at the local elections last year, so much so that Labour swept it and topped the poll across much of the Brighton Pavilion seat. Now, that has got a lot of Labour bigwigs talking, a lot of Labour strategists thinking, we could do this. And when they went for the selection, they thought this is a key seat for us. The Greens have chosen Sian Berry from London to go for it, and they are bussing in dozens and dozens of activists. So I think the Greens and Labour know it's up for contention. Now, there's also the case of Bristol Central. Thangam Debonair has a huge, huge majority in that Bristol seat. Used to be Bristol West, and it's become Bristol Central, even though it's even more western as a constituency geographically. But, that's the boundary commissioners for you. It's a tough ask there. We just had the local elections in Bristol. The Greens swept it. They didn't just defeat Labour, they absolutely pummeled Labour. They're getting more than 50% of the vote across all of the wards which make up the Bristol Central seat. It is a tough ask for Thangam there. It's a tough ask for Thangam Debonair there because she has a personal vote, but she is part of a brand that might not be particularly favourable in that Bristol area. It's going to be a challenge, really. How popular can a personal vote be for you? Can it allow you to keep on? Britain Predicts finds it's a tight fight. YouGov finds the Greens ahead. Let's see what happens there. But two fights for the Greens in which they are in competition with Labour. There's another one I recommend you keep an eye on, and it's called Waveney Valley in Suffolk here. Now, in parts of the country, in rural areas in which Labour and the Lib Dems have barely had any form of organisation, there's been a vacuum, inevitably. In history, it's often been filled by independents, local parties, smaller parties. In one part of Suffolk, actually, in many parts of Suffolk, the Greens have filled that vacuum, and they've really struck gold. So much so that they are the leader of the council in a whole host of rural areas that I don't think many of us can point to on a map. And one of them is Waveney Valley, which is just a little bit south of Great Yarmouth, north of Ipswich, and it's looking presently like Conservatives could hold it, but there is a strong Labour vote, but there's also a strong Green vote. And the question for the Greens now is, can you take enough environmentally conscious Tory voters to win the seat? And that's something we often forget about the Green appeal. It's not just the reserve of young hipster kids like those of us who listen to the New Statesman. It can also be the reserve of a great many people who are environmentally conscious, David Cameron backing Conservatives. And that's what we've been seeing in a lot of rural seats. And the Green appeal could, deliver as a surprise in Waveney Valley in Suffolk.
I want to ask you about the Lib Dems, but just a quick one before that. We've mentioned the Greens and bits of the Conservative Party, at least, are pursuing, in a way, the same policy. So Labour have got this pincer movement from both sides, a warning against them having a supermajority. Vote for us kind of on the left to stop them getting a supermajority, make them a bit more progressive perhaps. Vote for us on the right to stop them getting a supermajority, to stop them, having a field day. Is that a threat to Labour? Is there any danger that people will buy that narrative, they're 20 points ahead reliably and consistently? Are they going to suffer because of that?
They could. I don't think they will, but they could. There's a probability that it could happen. And I reiterate at the start, I don't think enough people are paying attention to the news to the point that they are so sure Labour's going to get in that they're going to change their voting intention accordingly. I think a lot more logged on people of greater affluence might change their vote, but I think those are going to be in places in which votes are already changing. So think of much of Hertfordshire, in which, people who might naturally go Labour would go Lib Dem, and there are plenty of seats in which that is already happening. And indeed also in Bristol, and maybe in parts of Liverpool, Manchester Central and others. But it will be in the areas in which most people are paying attention to politics. And they are unrepresentative areas. Okay, they are the areas in which are broadly safe-ish for Labour. Nevertheless, I do want us to pay attention to this. It's far be it from me to focus on one poll. Okay, you've always got to follow the trackers, always follow, the averages and such like. But there was one poll that got me thinking maybe we're onto something here. And it was YouGov's yesterday. Labour down to 38%.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you about this. Yeah.
Labour down to 38%. Lib Dems up big leagues. Reform up big leagues. And the Conservatives down to, 18%? Now, the Labour lead there, 20 points, comfortable. In line with what every poll tracker says, in line with what I'm saying, standard 20-point lead, fine and dandy. But you have to wonder, is this a sign of something else? Is Labour support seeping elsewhere? In theory, it could.
Well, Lib Dems are the big winners there, aren't they? 15%.
Yes, big winners, but when you delve into the subsamples, i.e. the cross breaks, what makes up the poll, you do find some quite silly figures. But I would nevertheless pay attention to it. I would nevertheless pay attention to more polls, basically. Could it be a sign that, whilst the Tory share is at rock bottom, Labour's may just edge a little bit lower because you have people being louder about their vote for the Lib Dems and Greens because it is a done deal? Well, that might happen. I'm not sure, but I think it's a possibility. But will it change the arithmetic in the Labour v Tory fights? Probably not. I think the current forecast, Labour on course for 400 or more seats, I think that's likely to still be borne out.
That YouGov poll was taken after the Lib Dems had launched their manifesto on Monday, but everything you've said, that wouldn't explain the 4-point uptick.
The idea that the Lib Dem launch of a manifesto is going to grab people's attention and, Ed Davey falling in a sewage-filled Cumbrian lake is going to change people's politics. No. I mean, it's good stunts for us to talk about, but most voters are not paying attention to it.
Any threat to Labour, Ben, that you're seeing in the numbers coming from the fallout from Vaughan Gething losing this confidence motion?
Yeah. So Vaughan Gething became Welsh First Minister, now, it was a few months ago. Where was it? Was it March or thereabouts? I can't remember. It was a very tight fight, by the way. And I think it really did come down to who the unions chose to endorse. Now, Vaughan started off pretty well with Welsh voters, okay? He talked about a review of the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, which has been introduced across the whole, vast majority of Welsh roads, which does get mentioned in polling, which does get mentioned on the doorstep and does appear to be hurting Labour a little bit, but I don't know to what extent. And he started off pretty well. But the furore surrounding donations, cover-ups, and such like, and indeed this vote of no confidence, does appear to have trashed what initial favourability he had. And I think it's something worth just mentioning. There is an assumption, I suppose, amongst a lot of us in England that, Wales is going to be very easy for Labour. But the polling points to Labour's share of support in Wales only going up by a little bit, not by much. Okay. The Tory share is crashing. A lot of it is going to reform. Okay. And that should probably work in enough Tory v Labour seats. But you do have what would be demographically Labour voters in England considering other parties in Wales. Some of them going to apathy because of the Welsh First Minister, because of the Welsh government and such like. Some of them considering Plaid Cymru, which is the Welsh Nationalist Party. And in places such as North Wales, such as Wrexham, the Clwyd, Bangor, Aberconwy and Ynys Môn, you do have what are in essence tight fights that might come down to the wire, because you have prospective Labour voters not going Labour, but either staying at home or going Plaid as a protest to the Welsh Senedd, the Welsh Parliament now. It's had an upgrade. And so that is something to just keep an eye on. But there's also a perception in Wales, just like what we have here in England. North-South divides. People in North Wales feel hard done to. They feel they don't get enough representation. And the 20-mile-an-hour stuff really actually has hit hard. Whether or not it's had a benefit, by the way. And by the way, the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour speed zones across the whole of Wales has generated a lot of opposition. Vast majority of voters opposed it. It's not like ULEZ in London, where votes were a hell of a lot more split. Vast majority opposed. But the data does show, apparently, that it is cutting the number of fatalities, the number of accidents, and number of such like. So it is an election issue. It is an election issue, but it does appear to be having benefits, like it or not.
Finally, Ben, any inkling of what's going on in Clacton and Nigel Farage and reform's chances there? I mean, he's not had a great week personally. He's had more things thrown at him yesterday while being on the campaign trail. Yeah. I believe he's getting extra security. I mean, no one would condone violence against any candidate. But any sense of what's going on in Clacton?
When Rishi Sunak called the election, Reform were on 11%, around about 10, 11% in the polls. And they've zoomed up to 14 to 15% now, okay, which is pretty notable. Now, in seats like Clacton, in seats like the whole east coast of England, small incremental increases Reform are big increases in seats like these, because it's where their prospective vote is. When I last was on this podcast, I did point out that a small few percent up for Reform does give them Clacton, does give them a few more seats. And already the most recent Britain Predicts forecast has Nigel Farage on course to take Clacton from the Conservatives. And the current numbers, as I just sit here, it's Reform 30%, Conservative 28%, Labour 22%, and smaller parties like, the Greens and others, 8% and 8%, 16% in total. And so that is actually something we need to bear in mind as well. Labour's going to come away with 40-something% of the vote nationally, but there's a hell of a lot of seats that will be won with just 30% of the vote or less. It's ridiculous. And what that is a consequence of the Tory vote crashing, going everywhere, and Labour only getting in on with 29% in a seat like, Skipton and Ripon, which I seriously doubt will happen, or the south of Herefordshire. But for Reform, Boston and Skegness is definitely one to watch out for. Has a very large Polish population, a great portion of which just, by virtue of being European citizens and not naturalized, can't vote. So the white English vote there is very much up for grabs for reform. It did do very well for reform and another right-wing party, the English Democrats, very old party that, in the police and crime commissioner elections. And then you've got other seats like Castle Point, which I think some of our competing journalist sites have gone to interview. This is the most Tory town in England. Why are you still voting Tory? Well, turns out they might not. Some of the Toryest towns that ever Toryed might be turning away from the Tories to reform. Castle Point, Clacton, Boston and Skegness, and it might just be that for them. They might only have a ceiling of 3 seats, if that.